We have about 2 minutes for questions. I know both of our speakers are going to be around for a little bit, but so.
Lois Epstein, the board of the trust, and thanks very much. Those were great presentations. Last year when Mark Brownstein from EDF was here, we heard that PHMSA does have the authority to regulate gathering lines, and yesterday we heard from Jeff that sometimes there isn't enough data to actually make the case to do that, and it seems to me that the data you've collected would be enormously helpful to actually make the case to OMB that here we have a significant need to actually go further with regulation of gathering lines. So I'm wondering whether that's the plan. and you know, it's certainly an enormous opportunity for PHMSA to make a great contribution to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, which isn't something they've done before. And then I have a second small question, which is, have you done any of this for oil gathering lines, which also have volatiles coming out? Thanks.
You have to push.
All right. So the second question is easier. No. We haven't done anything for the oil gathering lines. The first question is, I was actually at the EPA workshop yesterday in Pittsburgh, where okay, I can release that button. All right. But basically, the EPA greenhouse, the first step is actually reporting the emissions. And then, because right now, the greenhouse gas inventory relies on basically 20-year-old data. And so yesterday, they were actually incorporating a lot of our measurements into their inventory. The second part is the greenhouse gas reporting program is also, there are proposals to make it more comprehensive, and Jonathan is probably more familiar with that, but they are starting to require a lot more of the, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, Jonathan, but I think the proposal is basically to include more gathering facilities. There's partly a result of this study that they're actually making them report their methane emissions.
So just real quickly, I mean, one thing we know is that when we do these analyses, we find that facilities that are actually required to measure under the EPA requirements tend to reduce emissions much more than those that are not required to measure. And so there's an increasing effort to expand the amount of facilities that are required to be measured. That, of course, doesn't necessarily, and at this point clearly doesn't address the underground gathering lines, which is still, you know, to the data point that you made. But the more facilities are measured, the more we see reductions.
Dave.
Dave Johnson. Dave Johnson with Energy Transfer. Lois's question was about the very front end. Mine's about the very back end of the system. Looking at the work that was done in the cities, looking for leaks, I'm curious as to were any of those already known by the utility based on their own leak surveys or odor complaints, and if not, when they were investigated further, should they have been, like, did they rise to the LEL level that is supposed to be detectable?
It's a great question, because one thing that I didn't mention, and the folks from PG&E could speak to this probably better than EDF can, is that this equipment that we're using, and Picaro is not the only provider of it, now there are several others, is much, much more sensitive than the equipment that most utilities are using. And so when you use this sort of equipment, you find somewhere in the area of 3 to 5 times more leaks. And so, yes, there are a number of leaks that are being found there that are not on the utilities' inventories. There are also a number of leaks that the utilities are unable to validate based on the equipment that they're using, and I'll be frank about it, there's probably somewhere around 15% of what I would call false positives. But the second part of your question, we have found some very large leaks. By and large, the utilities were already aware of those leaks. There were a couple of situations where they were not aware of the size of those leaks, but typically both our data and the utilities' data match up in terms of their awareness of the leaks and their grading of the leaks for repair for the larger leaks.
Yeah, this Terry Boss with Inga. Appreciate the discussion. A lot of our companies participated on the transmission and storage efforts there. We're a little bit confused by some of the EPA proposals, which are talking about a widespread type of leak detection equipment, where a lot of the EDF results were clearly pointing out that it was open-ended pipes were the main source and super emitters. So it looks a little bit strange, you know, from the cooperative work that we've done here, that there's certain safety type devices that do have venting going on, and that's the predominant emissions that we're talking about in TNS. And yet EPA is proposing some widespread cover everything out there type connector thing. Any thoughts on that?
So, well, I mean, there's definitely for like I said, 90% of the facilities, for instance, a lot of the emissions, which are not super emitters, you have a lot of reciprocating venting, which might be a normal operating mode, and but you know, think about the one thing that I've learned. I mean, I had not been to a compressor station 3 years ago, and now I know a lot more about compressor stations, and you and Inga probably knows a lot more. The open-ended lines are really oftentimes a generic catch-all for emissions from anywhere in the facility. So a blowdown vent somewhere out in the field can basically have pipelines or manifolds being piped to it from different places on the facility. At least one of the super emitters that we do know was likely from a stuck isolation valve, which was basically the compressor was on not operating depressurized mode, it had blown down, but the other side of the isolation valve was regular pipeline pressure, 800 psi or 1000 psi or whatever it was. And so you have this, and you have a small leak across the isolation valve that's enough to produce these super emitter type emissions. And so, you know, those definitely, I think there's definitely a need, I think, for more leak detection and repair. So I think a lot of processing plants do that, and that's why we find that they are actually not a whole lot of methane is being emitted from these from the processing plants. And so, you know, I think, like I said, coming back to your question, is that open-ended lines are just a catch-all, and those could be emissions from anywhere in the facility. And so, you know, I think having some leak detection and repair is probably not a bad thing. But that gets into the policy debate, and that's where I'll hand it off to Jonathan.
Well, I mean, actually, I'll just very quickly say EPA proposed a whole host of different options, and we're developing comments on them, so I'm not going to speak to those until after we issue them. What I would say is that we know that much more frequent leak detection and repair programs are cost effective and have a big impact.